poetry is not just an Arabic phenomenon. And poetry in the Arabic world or the Arabic speaking world, especially in the peninsula, um, people may be more familiar with that history, or whether they know the specifics or not, they may be aware that there's a poetic history to the Middle East. I think the gap is that a lot of people, number one, they just don't know much about Aramaic speaking Christians. They don't know about Syriac Christianity is what we're talking about. Most people don't know it exists. Most people, if they know it exists, may not know the subtleties of it. So I think, what we have the opportunity to do is really just talk about the poetic tradition of the Syriac speaking Christians and, what that has meant for them and beyond. Do you have any initial reaction to poetry or anything like what do we need to know when it comes to poetry?
I think in the Western world, where Western academia rules and everything's based on kind of what was received from the Greco-Latin, I don't know, classics, like the way that they write, the scholasticism and legalism of the Latins and the philosophy of the Greeks. This has become kind of what is seen to be important and kind of worth reading and understanding. And poetry maybe has become a little bit disregarded or downgraded. I think it's underrated because of that. I think the entire Semitic, or at least Asian Semitic, culture, literature, landscape, it's based on poetry. I think Hebrew also, along with Arabic and Syriac, these are poetic languages, and religion, along with many other things, is found in poetry, and these things are expressed through poetry because poetry is good at expressing something in ways that in any case can't really be expressed. So I think the Western listener should kind of take a second look when he's looking into these kind of Semitic things, such as Christianity or Islam or Judaism, whatever it is, and kind of reassess his value for poetry.
Yeah. English language has, a number of luminaries when it comes to poetry, but it's maybe not as entrenched in our tradition as it might be, in the Middle East, where like that's the major form of discourse. Here in the West, we have this philosophical mind. We have this history of not just thought but rhetoric. Like, how do we express our thought? And the alternative to that is, is there a different form for expressing thought? And one of the major forms, it's a carryover from the ancient Near East, but it's poetry, and the poetic traditions really, they seem to carry with them the wisdom of that part of the world.
Yeah, I think it's also definitive. I think poetry is a definitive outlet in that part of the world, whereas maybe in the West it's not so definitive. It's kind of a secondary thing.
Yeah, it's like an art form in the West, right? It's one of the many things that we can utilize for whatever purpose, but usually it's for artistic purposes. I think there it's for discourse, and it's for communication and transmission of ideas. And so, maybe it has to do with literacy. and lack thereof. It's easier to memorize a poem than it is to write up a Roman style treatise.
Yeah, great point.
you
Sure.
know so with that, I think what we could do today is really expose people to some names, to some boss names, to some of the major figures of Syriac language poetry. And we could do a top 5, but you can't do the problem with that is and maybe we should let's still do a top 5, but maybe we need to start at number 1, and then we can get into the debates. Because I think when you do sports or something else and you have a top 10 or a top 5 reveal, who's number 1, this is a Michael Jordan situation. This is a
Undisputed.
yeah, right. It's Mike Tyson when he's 19, 20 years old situation. There's
not even be number 1 ever in any culture.
Yeah.
I
mean, number 1 is clear. So right, even once we said number 3, people would know, okay, well, the next one is 2, and then 1 is, we know who it is, because he's no one's touching it, right? Very MC Hammer, can't touch this. So let's go ahead and start. Who is number 1?
Ephraim.
Okay, I didn't even have to, there's no debate. We can each come up with our own lists of things, but objectively speaking, you can't have a subjective argument against Ephraim. There's no scenario where Ephraim is not number 1. Yeah. And there's a number of reasons for that. So for those listening who don't, you're learning about Syriac poetry for the first time, it's something, never been on your radar. You may have just learned the word Syriac means Aramaic, from the city of Edessa, popularized in the Christian era. It's just Aramaic, right? But it's a certain literary form of Aramaic. And Ephraim, in the West, he's called Ephraim the Syrian. The Syrians, they don't say Ephraim the us, right? Right. We don't say Michael Jordan the American. Yeah. You know what I mean? Something like that. Yeah. He's Ephraim, and then he has titles like the harp of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. That's a nice vote of confidence. Right?
He shares that with David.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
son of the Syrians, Sun.
Oh, that's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he's luminous, right? And so if you're listening, Ephraim, you can find him as Ephraim the Syrian. He's number 1. I'll give one. Let's just go back and forth as for the reasons why he's number 1. Yeah. Number 1 is the amount of work attributed to him. And we're not even talking about the, potentially spurious or pseudo Ephraim work. No. And there's a lot out there. Yeah. But just the attested, confirmed Ephraim work,
right?
Yeah, is voluminous.
Yes. So he has collections that are, it's hard to rate his collections against each other. If we're trying to do if we do maybe in the future a podcast to see what selection of hymns of Ephraim are a top 5 or a top 10 for him. That's hard. That's harder than this.
Yeah,
because he has so many, and they're all awesome. And they go to all types of learners. So somebody maybe like me or you, we're not really into the maybe the sciences of theology. We would prefer, say, hymns on paradise, whereas people who are more into kind of the the Christological debates against the Arians and stuff like that, maybe they'll go to the hymns on faith. And then he has it for all audiences. And the churches are still singing the hymns until now every day. And I only mentioned 2. There are a lot more. There are so many that only a minority has been translated into English. I think maybe I would venture to say that a minority has been found. I don't know if we've even found most of them. I don't know. You would know more than I would about that. There's a lot of it has been found in Armenian. Um, uh, it's really with Ephraim, it's like, where do you start? And you kind of read Ephraim to be like, okay, what do I like? So I'll read Ephraim and I find what I like in Ephraim, and that's kind of my path. He's kind of the door, and he's the field also. It's all the poets that we're going to mention later that come after him are based in him too. He's the foundation of this.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's so you're saying that we said voluminous, and then you said as an expansion of that, of all types, right? Like he ranges in type and he ranges in audience. You know, we could even take that to say he's an maybe innovator when it comes to the performative aspect of poetry, right? Like he's the one who gathers women chanters in the church, and the early days of the church, like it's kind of male dominated, and then these female choirs. I don't know. I don't know if there is backup, because there's no lead in poetry, right?
Yeah.
The funny thing is, like when you read the poetry, instead of having a lead and chorus, I mean, you have the refrains, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's not like Ephraim, and then he's got his background choir where he's jamming the whole time. Like everyone is meant to jam on the poetry itself, and then you get these. Or at least antiphonally, maybe you get one group doing one gudo doing one side, the other wall doing the other side, and then some have refrains, that they which would be like a chorus, but it's usually a one-liner, right? It's to hammer home an idea, and it's typically made, from my understanding, for the people who don't know the poem. But like this is why you have litanies and things in Christianity. You have the deacon deliver the prayer, and you have everyone respond, "Lord, have mercy." Like it's quite easy, right? And so you need very little training. You just need intention.
I think from a historical perspective too, like a biographical historical setting, the 4th century could be said to have been the golden age of patristics. It's before the schisms, Christianity was legal, people could be open about it, etc. Within that group, Ephraim had to have been such a big deal that out of all the other people from that time, Athanasius, the Cappadocians, I don't know, the Ambrose and Hilary and Jerome and all these guys, all in the same century. Ephraim is the only one who not only was he not a bishop, he was just a deacon.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in a remote corner of the empire, and he didn't know Greek, most likely. At least not well enough, like he wasn't like imperial, like I'm gonna go to kind of Athens or Constantinople or whatever. And he's still on that level of, we know who Ephraim is. Like how did he and this is not just now, like we know who Ephraim is. Even back then he was a big deal. Like Jerome knew about Ephraim, so that's how impactful he was on the universal church.
Yeah, I had read something. I know he'd been translated into Latin in an early period, and I don't recall this, so I hesitate saying it. I could be wrong, but that he was known even as far away as the British Isles. So this is like an Elvis, in his peak, right?
Yeah.
So Ephraim is. Say again.
As a deacon,
Right.
yeah.
And I think, maybe playing off what you said earlier too, like he writes something for everybody. How is he able to write something from everybody, or not from, but for everybody? He has such a depth of knowledge. Like if you spend time with Ephraim, you see that this person really, it makes you wonder how much preparation does one need to produce a real work of art? Whether it's a book, a poem, a painting, whatever the production is. How much do you need? Like, how much did Tolkien need in terms of language training and life experience before Lord of the Rings can be a thing?
Mm.
And look, I mean, The Hobbit is connected with it, and he has a couple other works, if you want to call the Silmarillion one of his works. I mean, it is, but it's kind of a background work. And does he have like 20 books? Does he have 20 things that went to market? And we just like Lord of the Rings best? Or is it kind of like whatever he went into the production of that text? So it makes me wonder about people like Ephraim, like how much time were they soaking in theology? Was he like a bona fide genius, a savant? And this is how he showcased his God-given talent. I mean, we have geniuses and we have people who, they're excessive in their ability to succeed. So I wonder, and I know that when it comes to training, he just had such a depth of knowledge of the theological and the ontological reality. Like, what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to live incarnationally? Because once you grasp that, that's really a key to storytelling. And what he was able to do through his poetry is just load it, like really maximize every ounce. So he captures the narrative of salvation history quite magnificently. He's able to package it too, maybe compress, right? Like he's able to deliver it in such a way that it becomes memorial.
Yes.
We're able to remember it. We're able to memorize scripture because of Ephraim. And so that yields comments like Jerome's, like it wouldn't matter if the world lost the scriptures because we have Ephraim's poetry.
Right.
And that's quite a profound statement from a translator of scripture. Someone who was a real devotee and someone who looked at scripture critically and spent so much time with it in different languages. At least 3: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin is Jerome's pedigree. So Ephraim it's not just the form, it's the substance, right? Like his forms are fantastic. And we read him now in English. Like we did I was teaching a class not long ago, and we're reading Ephraim, but I go, we have to chant Ephraim, and so he's meant to be chanted. You can get a book, and there's plenty of great books out there. Look up Ephraim the Syrian or Saint Ephraim, hymns on, whatever comes up, buy whatever comes up. It's really fantastic stuff, but it's meant to be delivered. So there's a form, but his content is really the key, right? Like his content's why we can read it in English and be like, wow, that's amazing. What an insight,
Absolutely. I think he's unique, not just in his style, but the Christianity that he expresses. It's kind of this, it's not touched by kind of outside things. It's very local. So he knows, he has the Syriac scriptures that he inherits, he has the Jewish traditions that are in Syriac in the same area, whether it's in Nisibis or Edessa. And he expounds his theology based on that. So in a sense, Ephraim himself is Syriac Christianity conform. Like he creates the conformation, the conformity of Syriac Christianity, and then those after him continue it and build on. So whereas maybe before him, maybe it's a little bit more decentralized, and Ephraim is the figure in which Syriac Christianity, I think, finds a meeting place.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we could go to honorable mention, right? So we went to number 1 already, but we'll name someone on the honorable mention list, and that's Bardaisan, who is a poet.
Yeah.
We have to mention him now, even though he's honorable mention category, because Ephraim basically took his rhymes and spat them back at Bardaisan. You know, he's rhyming a certain way, and Ephraim, like, you know, he knocked him out. He counterpunched, and knocked him out. And
I think of it as Michael Jordan idolized Dr. J, and then he was better than Dr. J. So Ephraim took Bardaisan's measurements of poetry, his meters, and he did them better than Bardaisan did. And he wrote against Bardaisan's heresies with the same measures, and we haven't heard of, like, I don't see in the historical record that heresy continuing after Ephraim's time. Ephraim might have closed the door on them.
Knockout, right?
Yeah.
You know, once Mike Spinks is knocked out by Tyson, it's done. Or Larry Holmes, right? Somebody, you know, like whatever they did before that was good is forgotten about.
Right.
Okay, well, I think, you know, we could probably, I mean, look, we're going to be talking about Ephraim all the time just because he's not a one-time conversation. He's so, like you said, he helps form the tradition. Mm-hmm. And because of that, he's such a central figure in Syriac Christianity. We'll come back to him again and again. How about number 2? Who do you have for number 2?
I have Jacob.
Okay, Jacob of Sarug, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, so Ephraim is a universally acknowledged number 1. Jacob of Sarug is pretty much a number 2, but people could try and debate that. And I think, you know, whereas Ephraim's called the harp of the Holy Spirit, Jacob is called the flute of the Holy Spirit, right? Which is, that's kind of cool. I don't know.
Yeah.
You like
and these are translations of Middle Eastern instruments, right? So the closest thing in the West to what they're saying is a harp or a flute, but that's not literally the instrument that we're talking about. Then it's nai. The nai is it makes people cry from how beautiful it is. So Jacob, it really is. And you and I have talked about this before. I've told you that I always think of it. I don't know why I always put it with basketball players. So with Ephraim being Jordan, Jacob is Kobe, in that it's very obvious in that he is copying Ephraim on purpose, and he builds on Ephraim. Like the implications of Ephraim's theology, Jacob continues them in and he uses the same style of poetry. I think, and I could be wrong on this just because I haven't seen it. I hope I'm wrong on this, but I think kind of the expectation that Syriac theology, that this is the primary expression of Syriac theology, poetry, I think Jacob is the last one who does that. Unfortunately.
Yeah, right. Before it gets, what would we say, mixed?
Yeah.
You know, or influenced, you know, or where, you know, Greco-Roman discourse sort of enters into the conversation, and stylistically, you know, it changes what people talk about and why. I mean, that's even with Jacob, you have that, and you know, maybe our number 3, we can talk about Jacob some more. I mean, before we get to number 3, but like his whereas Ephraim may be a 7 syllable guy, Jacob goes to 12, right? He expands it to 12, and he's known for that.
Exactly.
Yeah, his work is becoming almost as popular in English because people, like, oh, you're going to publish on Ephraim too? Like, people need other things to translate, right? And so, and Jacob is such a prolific source, and there's a lot of his work, and much of it is preserved in Arabic, and in places like Egypt, right? I was reading a manuscript not too long ago from St. Catherine's. It was an Antiochian manuscript, and even they venerate, Jacob of Sarug, right? And like, so it's not quite universal, but up there, and his work is beautiful. I don't know if there's any look in this. We talk about if consensus and stuff, it doesn't make it true, right? Like, just because everyone recognizes Ephraim, like maybe someone likes Jacob better.
Yeah,
it's possible. But I like your comparison, Michael Jordan to Kobe Bryant, because of that. He is picking up off it. He is like, like Kobe looks to Michael Jordan in order to be a better Kobe,
right.
And like, it's a clear relationship between, this isn't disciple student quite, because there's a larger gap in time.
Mm-hmm.
It's the next century over, but it's later in the next century. So
yeah, and in the patristics, it's a little bit easier because of the humility rather than the competition. So, yeah, Christian humility and all that. I think Jacob would it's not even a question to him that Ephraim is greater than he is, right? Even though he's a bishop and Ephraim was a deacon, but Jacob would recognize Ephraim as the greater one. Obviously, with modern basketball, everyone needs to think they're the best, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But I don't think. See, when we read Jacob and we see Jacob's greatness, even in my opinion, even that is attributed to Ephraim. Like, as good as Jacob is, that only makes Ephraim better. Like, I really don't see any scenario where Ephraim can ever not be number one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You need someone who's, like, they're primed from birth. Their dad is, Marv Marinovich, like putting them through, the grinder as an adolescent, so that they grow up. I don't know, maybe Caleb Williams coming up, see what he does in the NFL. But you'd have to have someone who kind of like is clearly gifted from scratch. And maybe that's the case, right? You get an Ephraim to emulate, and unless you are a savant, maybe those who are super talented and regular folks who want to achieve like Ephraim, maybe we're more like Jacob if we can be that successful. We have something to shoot for, someone to emulate. Like, who's Michael Jordan emulating, right?
Yeah.
Who's jumping like that? It's he's a groundbreaker. And well, should that swing us to 3? I would put my number 3 in conversation with Jacob of Sarug. I don't know where yours is. Who do you have at number 3?
Lona.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I was gonna put Narsai at 3, and
I'm a little biased, maybe.
Lona at 4.
Yeah.
And I think that Narsai is part of that equation. I don't know if you want to call him. And look, forgive me for saying this, and I'm saying that to Narsai. I'm not saying it to anyone else. But maybe he's a LeBron if Jacob of Sarug is Kobe.
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
So I have to apologize to Narsai for that. But he's venerated in the Church of the East, and his work, it's going to be more in that I don't want to say it's directly under the influence of like the Greco-Roman tradition. In a way it is, but I think it also represents a sort of a Persian sensibility that you don't need to be involved in Greco-Roman theology in order to produce some of the work that Narsai did. And so he's like a Jacob, and he's just as influential for the Church of the East. And between him and Jacob, they have a disputed hymn. They have a disputed chant. You familiar with which one it is?
I can't. It does not come into mind.
You might pray it on Sunday when you take communion.
Moran Terham Alain?
How Nurane.
Howd Nurani. Okay. Yeah. I didn't know that it's attributed to Narsai too.
Yeah, and so like at the end of our hour, we're both Syriac Orthodox, for those listening and don't know. For at the end of our poem, and we say, do we say good memory to Jacob the Malfono? Like we have this little line at the end just to make sure people know who wrote it and that it's not Narsai. There's I think George Kiraz did a paper on it a long time ago where, like you can't tell. You don't know who did it, right?
Okay.
I mean, we put the byline at the end.
I think Narsai is older than Jacob. They might have overlapped, but I think Narsai has him a few years on Jacob.
Yeah, I think what Kiraz concluded was that, well, you can't tell, except that there's certain terminology that is more popular in the Miaphysite camp than it is in the Diophysite or the Church of the East camp. So like the parlance sounds more, like, people in the Syriac Orthodox tradition than the Church of the East. But in the end, it's cool that it's one of those hymns that, works both ways. And, they attribute it to him. And actually, when it comes to Narsai, I heard there was a former Protestant preacher who became part of a schismatic Orthodox jurisdiction that fashioned itself on the Syriac Orthodox Church. And this guy was raised by Pentecostals. And so his name was Veron Ash. He went by Mar Enoch. Do you know about him?
I haven't heard of him. No.
So, I mean, he sounds like a Pentecostal. I mean, I think he was, but he sounds like a Pentecostal preacher. And one thing he was trying to do at one time was utilize that as a vehicle for spreading orthodoxy. I knew some folks affiliated with his communion, and evidently one of the raiders was a tithing member of his church at one point.
Nice.
But in any case, they sort of did their own thing. Things changed a little bit on his end, and he eventually passed away maybe a decade ago or so. And I know other people who, they entered different Orthodox communions because of his preaching. Yeah. But one thing he would do is he'd take like the fathers and he'd Pentecostalize them. So I heard one of Narsai's poems being, how do you say it? Being, it's not chanted, but when you get on a roll, there's a term for it. I forget what it's called. In any case, in his preaching, he preached one of Narsai's, poems in a Pentecostal style and was getting everybody fired up in it. So
wow.
Yeah, but you'd have to know that he's doing Narsai, right? Like,
yeah, I'm guessing
you have to know Narsai to know this. I mean,
right.
There's a version of this in the Eastern Orthodox that's attributed to Ephraim, but I'm pretty sure it's like, oh no, it's the Syrian poem. Oh, okay, so it's Ephraim. They're like, yeah, because they didn't want to say it's Narsai's, so they have a version of it. The punctuation at the end is different, nice. But it's effectively the same poem. But anyway, Narsai is my number 3. Tell us more about Lona.
I mean, there's different opinions of who he was. Some people say he was Ephraim's nephew. Some people say he was just a student. Some people say he wasn't even a student. He was like a student. Um, it seems like he was right before the 5th century Christological controversies. And like Jacob, he also has that same tone of building on Ephraim. You could, I think, visibly see very similar themes and then expounding on those same themes. Like Jacob does it more, and he does it. It's there's more substance in Jacob's, and the body of work is much greater for Jacob. But Cyrilona, in those that we have from him, it's in the same family. Like it would like reading Ephraim and then reading Cyrilona and reading Jacob. It's like you'll feel like these guys are in the same team. These guys are saying the same thing, and they're doing it in the same way. So it's like a little Jacob. Cyrilona is like a little Jacob, I would say.
Yeah, and we don't have as much of his stuff too. I think that that kind of, it's like he retired after a couple years. If we're
Exactly.
still using the NBA thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, well, what could he have, or did he play in a different league and only did 3 years or something in the NBA? That's the kind of the question. I think that remains, and even then, it's still pretty high ranking. Whether he's 3 or 4. Do you have a number 4?
I do. Let me hear yours first. Your number 4.
Well,
Cyrilona?
Yeah, I mean, I could put Cyrilona at 4.
Okay.
I could do an alternative,
No, that's fine. So I want to say Isaac of Antioch, but I also don't want to piss off any of the Narsai people. But yeah, I was gonna say Isaac of Antioch because his poetry was so important on an official level, whereas the people we mentioned earlier, maybe Jacob's was too, but I think Isaac of Antioch was in a more critical situation. Jacob, being rural, didn't really have to deal with, what's the political stuff that was happening directly. Isaac of Antioch was in Antioch.
Yeah.
I don't think he was a bishop either, by the way. So his poetry was about exactly the controversy. He dealt with it firsthand. He wasn't trying to avoid it. It was like kind of like Tupac with "Hit 'Em Up" kind of stuff. Like he has the poem with the parrot with the trisagion saying, "Who was crucified for us?" in the trisagion. This is during the Hinodicon. So like it's a very controversial time, like LA riots, but worse. And he was still putting
Commemoration Day, April 29th.
Okay.
No, I'm not saying that. That's the LA riots, not Isaac of Antioch. Sorry, guys.
So he's doing it in that context. And for people who express theology through poetry, it doesn't, especially that late in patristics, it doesn't get that loud like for those types of people. But Isaac did it, so I think that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, no, he's definitely got some brilliant stuff. I was reading the other day his hymn on Adam and Eve. Maybe we'll include that in the sidebar or something. Well, does that leave us then with our fifth? And who does he? I think we kind of lost the NBA, the NBA parallels here, but that's okay. I mean, because then I'll start. Actually, have to think and justify things. You got to find someone who's a magic and a bird.
I know. I
don't know if we can do that.
Here's like we said Ephraim was Jordan, but he's like Magic Johnson too at the same time.
Yeah, it's tough. Well, maybe we'll do that. We'll do a different episode that's specific to like NBA, and NBA history and Orthodox saint parallels. But number 5. I'm curious where you could go with this. We could. So let's, if you're going to say Narsai, we have Narsai and Cyrilona. We can cancel those out. Let's add one, right? Like,
Okay.
or if you take him as 5, we talked about it. Does that go back to me then for a 5?
Yeah, who's your 5?
Well, okay, so it's tough. I think because of the backstory and because of the impact, the legacy of this person, because it's not a person. He's the lead singer of a band, if you think of it that way, right? What's a band name that's named after the front man, right? Like that's kind of this person. Okay. So I'm going to say Shamun Cocoyo, Simon the Potter.
Okay.
And the reason for that is right. So all my band names were heavy metal anyway. I didn't want to do that for this video. So I'm trying to think of someone else that's a full band, but maybe I'll edit it in post. But so for those who don't know, Simon the Potter, Shamun Cocoyo, is a guy who's a potter. Yay! That's what he does. He makes pottery and other fine crafts. You can visit him at the bazaar in northern Syria. So why is he there? Well, all these potters, like they're creating pottery and they're working these potter's wheels. So the drone of the potter wheel and the sound it makes is like the background beat that is produced, and they're basically in this workshop, or they're working with these beats going on. So what do? If you're a devotee, you're an Orthodox Christian, your life, your work is a spiritual calling. That whatever you do, you want to do well, or in the service to God and your neighbor, right? Like that's where your head is. And then you've got these beats going, right, as you work. So they start creating these jams that are prayed to this day, right? And was it Jacob or more so? I think it was I forget which bishop walked by and heard it and then took it to the patriarch. Jacob, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, dude, he
like took it to Severus
in Back to the Future, right? Chuck, it's your cousin Marvin Berry. That new sound you've been looking for? Well, listen to this, right? And so he tells them about this new band, and he recites their music, and they're like, I like that. That's cool. Let's put it in the liturgy. So we have these sections of variable hymns in the liturgy, and they're really populated by the Cocoyo hymns, right? And now they have their own tone, that's unique to them. And you can do a Cocoyo in, any of the 8 tones or more with its beginning and closings and things. So I would go with Shamun Cocoyo, and what they were able to produce and the situation that gave rise to their poetry. Like, who would they have been without that job, right? Like, maybe would they have been poets on their own? Would they have been servants of the church? Or they've been guys who were poets and we just don't hear their names? Like, I know the culture's still filled with people like this. What do you got?
I mean, unfortunately he was not on my mind, and when you mentioned him, I'm like, I have to steal Malfono's number 5. I'm gonna have him too now for number 5, Shamun Cocoyo. I think how could I have forgotten? For a bishop to notice a potter, and then the bishop being Jacob, a great poet himself, so obviously he knows what talent is. He sees it from this guy who's just making pots. Then he goes and tells the patriarch about him, Saint Severus, who, by the way, wrote hymns. And then Severus and Jacob and that synod of that time puts the Cocoye. The part of the prayers are till now called Cocoyo. So we're still chanting it, and it's called like pottery.
Yeah,
That's a
right.
section of the hymn.
Pottery. What is this?
So we're still it's still called that because of him. So the impact he had, and I think I don't know how much. So there's the sections in the Shhimo, the daily prayers of the Syriac Orthodox Church, and then I think also there's a collection of nativity hymns attributed to him. I'm not sure what else is out there, but yeah, that's a very important figure. Absolutely.
Well, then, can we keep counting? I mean,
Let's do it.
we got a top five. This is
Yeah.
the problem, right? Like some of these, we may have to jockey around, and be like, because I can't believe number 6 is number 6. He
Hmm.
should be higher. He should be 3 or 4 or
Yeah.
5.
Yeah.
And I like. So I won't say Isaac of Antioch because you already did, but fair enough. He's on my list too. I don't know how to do the numbering system. Maybe
Yeah.
we'll come up with a finalized form at the end. But
Right.
do you have a
Like,
number 6, or should I tell
yeah.
you?
Look, any not probably a not biased person, so not me, would have Narsai at like 2 or 3. Yeah. I'm gonna put him at 6. Um, just to say I didn't not have him on my list. Let me see if there's okay. The My ranking system, what are the qualifications I'm looking for, or the kind of the resume, or I want it to be thematic. Like I want it to
Mhm.
be one builds on the other and continues to go on. I feel like you said it perfectly that Narsai is like LeBron because it's something that is not hadn't been seen before. Narsai kind of is a new strand of Syriac poetry, whereas these guys kind of come from the same cloth that we talked about. Um, some people think maybe that's a good thing. Some people think maybe it's not. Uh, for me, it's a different conversation. So I would put it number 6 is fine. Our side, I'll believe in.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, we're building a roster. Maybe we're
Yeah.
building a roster of different people, 5 men on the floor, and then Narsai's on the bench for you. Uh, for me, this person on the bench, I feel bad. I mean, he could be starting on a number of teams. It's Balai,
Oh yes.
right? Like, see,
Yeah.
when I say it, you're like, why isn't he up at number 3 or 4?
Right.
Right? Um, but
Marbala.
like that's the issues. Like now you have at the top something very clear, you know, complete category above everybody else. Then maybe you have, a different tier. And look, to be fair, I think I don't know that I would rank LeBron as high in the top 10,
Mhm.
if that, right? Like people give
Yeah.
me hell for that, right? But like
Yeah.
he's either 11 or 10. Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
like if you
Yeah.
know basketball before the 80s, come on, like get serious. There's, like, anyway, that's another conversation. But like Balai he's fantastic. We pray him till today. Like he's part of Shemo. Like we every week, we're flexing his jams, right? Like
Yeah. See, whenever I remember these guys, Narsai drops a spot every time.
so Balai 6, Narsai.
Yeah.
Well, where are you
It's,
gonna?
I don't know. Were you watching basketball like in the like Kobe's last title runs, like 09, 10? We had Lamar Odom coming off the
Yeah,
bench.
sure.
Nobody has Lamar Odom coming off the bench.
Yeah.
And then 11, he wins 6 man of the year, Lamar Odom.
Wow.
But any other team, he would start with them,
Right.
you know. So it's like you have such a loaded roster. It's like Team USA basketball playing internationally. Your bench guys are the best players on their teams.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um. Yeah.
Like, did
With
Larry
that,
Bird start on the Dream Team? I don't think he started. He was he? He
Well, I
was
mean, he was retiring from back surgery, so I don't know
right.
if he started.
Yeah,
I mean, he definitely wasn't the Bird of the 80s,
right,
but he was still Larry Bird, and he carried it, right?
right,
So
right.
I'm trying to recall. I mean, 92 was a long time ago,
Mhm.
but I don't think he started.
Yeah, I don't think
Could
so
be
either.
wrong. If we're wrong, post below.
Yeah.
Let us know. Who was starting those games, and if he started any or one of the medal games.
Hmm.
But yeah, do we have anyone who kind of had a career and then pulled back? I don't know. That's a tough one. I think for 7, you could also put in someone like Georgis Warda, and all the people who do the onyatha, like these ornitha style, poems that's popular
Yeah.
in the East. Um, you
You know,
could,
Narsai, something that Narsai did that Jacob, this is unique to Narsai, Jacob, and Ephraim. Nobody else does this that I've seen. Um, this is why I guess Narsai's name is, I think, as big as the top three guys. Like he's a top three name for sure, no question. Uh, it's the sugiyatha.
yeah. Explain what those
That's
are.
so the sugiyatha are dialogue poems. Sugiyotho is in the Western Syriac. Um, they're like skits almost. There's
Yeah.
roles for the characters like scripted, and it's poetry back and forth, and it's chanted, and it's done to illustrate biblical stories. So either Old Testament, New Testament, or on feast days, the resurrection. There's a famous one that is done um, is Malacha Giyasa, where the angel who is supposed to have been guarding paradise from when Adam and Eve were kicked out, um, all of a sudden sees the thief on the right approaching paradise after the crucifixion. And he's like, "Are you lost? What are you doing?" Like the first guy I see is a thief, since Adam and Eve have left. And so it's this back and forth. And the angel's like, "There's no way I'm going to let you in." And eventually he lets him in after he tells him what happened. So say Ephraim wrote this, and Narsai did these, and Jacob did these. Now, because of the Christological time, like controversial times that Jacob and Narsai lived in, their sugiyatha encompassed these situations too. So, like Narsai, for example, has one Cyril versus Nestorius, a
Mhm.
back and um, Ephraim, Jacob's happened to be less kind of less confrontational. Jacob tends to take a more biblical approach. Sometimes he does get that way, but not always. Like he does one about the church versus like Chalcedon or something like that. But there's one. Sebastian Brock actually recently published a collection of sugiyatha hymns by various Syriac authors. The church versus the synagogue, back and
Mm.
forth. So that's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that's prayed on Bright Saturday, right? And
Hmm.
if you ever get a chance to visit the Church of the East, I mean, it's a nice um, service, where there's kind of a tug of war that happens liturgically. A priest and a deacon, pull this shaft sort of thing, and it's a interesting liturgical experience too. But like, it's made for that setting, right? It's not all this poetry, by the way, it is made in to be worshipped. Like it's to be used in worship and not just because it's cool, and
Yeah.
not a jam you put on in the car. You can do that, but like it wasn't designed for that. It
Hmm.
was designed, with worship in mind. So I guess we've got 7 or 8. Have you,
Um.
know,
Okay, so we said my Narsai would be 7, right?
yeah,
So 8. Okay, I know Efrahat's demonstrations are prose,
yeah,
but and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Manfono, the Syriac, he does a lot of play on words a lot of the time. It's like poetic. The way he does the prose even is poetic. Would you say he's on the list at all?
It's tough. I mean, then it's a question of what's poetry.
Yeah.
And I think you opened up talking about this region, the world, and how Syriac is a poetic language. And I completely agree. In fact, I did a video not too long ago on, is Syriac or is Aramaic a theological language? And, in the end, it is, because of how its words are formed and how etymology is actually used for things like wordplay. Like that's clever, it's creative. And so maybe the poetry is about the performative aspect of the poem, and not necessarily whether we would consider something poetic, because that's the tough thing. I mean, you could look to a number of works and see how profound they are in terms of nuance, and how people are using language. They're crafting their discourse with language. Like language is really crafted for it. And so, I mean, that's an interesting take. And I think on my end, like I kind of run into a wall a little bit because we get a lot of anonymous poetry. That's really cool. We get pseudo poetry. That's cool. I mean, like the nice thing about Ephraim too is when you have someone like Ephraim and then you have a real tradition of piety, you'll have people get excited about a poem and then the monk just say, no, it was Ephraim, because they don't want, the notoriety, they don't want to be associated with it. So then he accretes all the pseudo Ephraim onto Ephraim, right?
Yeah.
And it's an interesting question. I think, I haven't done this, so I don't know, but I think someone could probably do a study of, whether it's Afrahat or the Book of Steps and look at them as like, are these poetic works? Even if they are delivered according to what we would call prose. I mean, maybe you have to go read someone like Anton of Tikrit, people who like classify poetry, Yakub Barshako or somebody, like people who they write about it. Even there's a Maronite, do you remember his name? Stephen Estefan El Duwayahi or something. I forget. But there's a bunch of people who comment on poetry. Like, what about Morphiloxenus Yohanan Dolibani, right? Like people who, I mean, he is a poet too, right? Like he wrote poetry.
Yeah.
And then there's a bunch of people that we know were poets, but like I haven't encountered their material knowingly, right? Like, could they have been one of the anonymous poems? Or maybe I know them from other works like Morgiwargis, the Hasio, the Tayyai, the Bishop of the Arabs, in Iraq. He was a poet too.
Yeah.
But I can't think of examples of his work, or Moryakub of Edessa, right? Like people wrote poetry. And there's a number of luminaries. I'm sure.
Odessa, of course,
Right? Church of the East too. I mentioned Georgis Warda, but I'm sure there's a lot more. People that we just may not come in contact with, and that's the tough thing too, right? Like we sort of, if you're not touching it all the time in Syriac, you kind of have to rely on translation, whether it's English or Arabic. A lot of it's still translated into Arabic. Like you mentioned earlier, Ephraim survives in Armenian. Yeah. And does it come across as poetry? I know there's Armenian people watching the channel. Like, if you know of that, how does Ephraim come across in Armenian? So I don't know. I guess we got our starting 5 and our 2 backups. Coming up with a solid 12 would be filling in with other names that we know, but maybe can't justify. Like I can list off names, but I don't know, like I just said, some of their works.
I want to add just at number 10, I want to put, although he it's probably a translation into Syriac, but still, because it was so effective and impactful, is Saint Severus of Antioch's hymns, Togut Suryoye,
Yeah.
and on Virgin Mary and on the different feasts. Mormelko is one of them. So
Yeah, so that's the ma'anith of the Morsawarius that the
yeah.
Syrians pray at the beginning of their liturgy, and it's called monogenes in the Coptic and Byzantine tradition. With Severus, it's interesting you bring him up because he's writing in Greek, right?
Yeah.
But the translators translate him into poetry.
Yeah, I know.
Like that's a
So they make him a poet.
like there's rhyme and rhythm
Right.
to more rhythm than rhyme, but still, yeah, that's an interesting thing. I mean, I wonder if it goes backwards too. Like, do we ever have any I wonder if there are any Syriac Antiochian manuscripts of Romanos.
I
Right?
wouldn't be surprised.
I mean, he's a Syrian who made poetry in Constantinople, but it comes out in Greek. So do we have it returned? Like kind of like the Bible, right? Like you can look at the Greek New Testament and be like, well, that's phrased a little bizarrely. Then someone who speaks Syriac translates it to Syriac in the ancient days. Well, wait, there's a better. That's a theological thing. In the olden days, a long time ago, right? Classical era, Pshita translation, let's say. And it makes perfect sense in the Syriac because it's a known idiom, right? Like it's not problematic in Aramaic. It's maybe a little awkward in Greek. Do we have the same sort of thing where when something is translated, like, okay, the New Testament is Aramaic speaking people who are writing in Greek, and then it gets back translated into Aramaic. So that their mind and their culture, their worldview is Semitic. Someone like Romanos, who's a Syrian poet and goes to, Byzantium and he writes poetry in Greek, does it come back our way? I mean, I know there's like the Kanun Yanoi. We have these hymns that are based on popular Greek melodies and things. I'm not sure who they're attributable to. I know it's like kind of the 9th century, but I don't know who's doing it. And if we're like appropriating, like we Syriac Orthodox are appropriating things, or if we're kind of inspired sort of by the form, right? Yeah, there's a limit to our knowledge too. I mean, we know a lot of stuff, but we don't, once we get into the finer details, now we'll have to research them. We can give you an answer. We can give you an answer, but let us go research a little further. So I wonder if Romanos, like if there's something similar that happened, but Severus,
Good question.
or teams, we'll call it Team Severia. How do you put him on the team? He's got to be on the bench. Is he a coach?
He's like the player coach. He's like
Bill. He's a player coach.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That works. Well, I think we kind of tapped out the popular poets, but if you're listening and maybe, there's someone from like the Maronite tradition that we missed or are not familiar with. I don't know how much would have come through like the Chaldean or Syriac Catholic that's unique to them and not part of the common heritage of the Church of the East or the Syriac Orthodox. Yeah. But if you're listening, feel free to chime in. This is a cool field, and you're going to know Ephraim. You're going to know his name. His works are the easiest to access in English. And then, maybe down the line, and if we can start, getting the works of these others translated, I mean, do we even have Isaac of Antioch in English?
I don't think so. Not that I know.
Yeah. Okay, I'll append one to this video, maybe, nice. Or put a stanza or something on it.
I don't think we have him or more Balai in English.
Really?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Low hanging fruit then. That's always something to get out there. Any last thoughts?
Cocoyo, there might be. I think Dr. Brock might have done a translation on him, but the other two, no. not yet.
Any final thoughts on poetry, on the Syriac tradition? What people should look out for, why it's important.
Yeah. So maybe when someone first hears like the word of poetry, it's not as enticing, but it's not what you think. Go read it. Go, like Manfono said, check out Saint Ephraim, and it will change your mind about what this actually is, what it is we're talking about. There's great poetry in the West, like Dante, and in the Divine Comedy. There's Shakespeare's plays and things like that, where that's kind of like maybe a different style of sugiyatha and whatever. But for this is like something that I think the Western reader hasn't seen before. So we encourage you guys to check this out. Absolutely.
Awesome, man. Thanks for showing up. And I like the impromptu MBA comparisons. That's given us some good material for later on too.
Awesome.
So, all right, go listen to some of the poetry. If you maybe I'll put some in the links if we have any. But we just want to thank everybody for listening and joining us. And if you have questions about Syriac language, the Syriac Aramaic language, classical Syriac is what we're talking about, or these poets, or where you can hear these poems prayed, what kind of books. Again, we'll put a list of their names in the description, and let that list sort of be your guide if you want to take this further and do some more research.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.